Good morning, church. It's good to see all of you. Welcome to Overland SDA Church. We're so happy that you're here to worship with us in person or online. We're so happy that you're here. If you have not been with us in a while or joining us for the first time, we are going through our sermon series, our third one this year, under the Build Church theme. We're talking about lamenting. And the reason why we're talking about lamenting is because the point of this quarter is to help build our church, to prepare the church to then go out into Orange County, into wherever we are, and to build God's kingdom. But for us to do that, the church must be ready first, right? You can't just go out and do these things. We have to prepare ourselves first. And one of the ways that we prepare our church is to become very comfortable and familiar with lament. And so the purpose of this quarter is to create a space in our worship service for both praise and celebration and lament as well. And so we're going to be going through the book of Lamentations this quarter. We're going to talk about the historical perspective of lament. So what happened to the Israelites during this time? We're going to talk about our church's kind of corporate or kind of global communal big picture level of what we can do. And then Pastor DP will come in and talk about the personal application. Because we believe that while the entity of church is important, our individual connection to church is important as well. So we want to hit those three things in our sermon series. Last week, Pastor Isaac kind of kick-started this series in earnest, and he introduced a Hebrew word. Does anyone remember that word? It's ekah, and that is translated to how. But like Pastor Isaac said, it's not how in the way we understand it. It's not like a question of curiosity, like, how do these lights work? Or how does a camera work? It's more of like a rhetorical, like, guttural, like, how? How is this happening? Like, how is this happening to me? And so today we're going to introduce a second Hebrew word. It's shalom. Who here knows what shalom means? Raise your hand. It's one of those Hebrew words that kind of gets passed around in popular culture. Shalom is translated as peace. But much like ekah, the way we understand this word shalom is not quite the same as what the Bible intended it to be. This word peace, how do we define peace? We generally, especially in the Western culture, we define peace as the lack of conflict, right? So when we say something like, I wish there would be peace on earth, what exactly are we hoping for? The lack of conflict, right? No more war, no more conflict, no more fighting. That's what we mean as peace. However, the original Hebrew definition and understanding of this word was not that. That is not what the Israelites meant when they used this word shalom, right? Because our understanding, it's not equal, it's one-sided. Right? It's the absence of conflict, and it's the presence of a lack of conflict. But the original understanding of shalom was more balanced. It was not the elimination of conflict or suffering. It was accepting suffering to be in a place of balance. So to put another way, it's not eliminating suffering, it's embracing it, going through lament to be able to also celebrate. A system where all the parts kind of cohere and come together in peace. To put it more simply, shalom actually requires lament. That's the only way we can experience true shalom, is to experience and acknowledge the lament that we have in our lives. And that is really what lamenting is, right? It's accepting the reality that is set in front of us. If there's suffering going on and you don't accept that reality, is there a need for you to lament? No, right? Because you're not acknowledging the suffering, right? We call that denial, by the way. When the suffering's happening and you don't acknowledge it, that is denial. But when you accept the reality of suffering, then it enters into the process of lament. The biblical definition of lament, by the way, is a liturgical response to the reality of suffering and engaging God in the context of pain and trouble. So lament is not just the crying out in sadness. It contains within it the hope that God is listening to our cries and God will do something about it. So within lament, there is also an element of hope. The hope that God hears us and the hope that God will respond. And again, there's so many examples of lamenting in the Bible, right? The first main one is the Israelites in Egypt. They cried out to God with the hope that God would hear them. And this happens, again, on a kind of a corporate, Israelite level and also on the individual level. Individuals have cried out in lament to God. So, the reason why we need to talk about lament, the reason why we're talking about lament in Build Church, not Build Us, is because the modern church has kind of shifted away from a place of lament. Right? It's kind of moved away from acknowledging and creating a space for lament, and it's kind of thrown this balance off kilter. It is an unbalanced worship experience. There's a lady named Denise Hopkins. She's a religious historian, and her focus is actually the Psalms, the book of Psalms in the Bible. And she went through basically all the major denominations in Christianity, and she studied their specific writings on the book of Psalms. So for example, let's say she's looking at Adventist. She would go to like the ABC, the bookstore, and look at all the books that we've written about the book of Psalms. So devotionals, Bible studies, commentaries, whatever it is. And she would just kind of see what was in them. And what she found was that most denominations, in their writings and studies in the book of Psalms, they tend to skip the parts of the Psalms that deal with lament. So they focus a lot more heavily on the Psalms of praise and celebration, and they tend to skip the Psalms of lament. There's another Christian writer named Glenn Pemberton. He says that if you read the book of Psalms, about 40% deal with lament in the Bible, the book of Psalms. 40% of the book of Psalms deals with lament. Most of the hymns that we sing today and in the past, a lot of them were derived from the book of Psalms. In fact, a lot of our hymns, like word for word, line for line, lifted straight from the book of Psalms. So Glenn Pemberton, he studied all the hymnals that we have. He says about 13 to 19% of our hymns deal with lament. So this is like traditional hymns. The CCLI, which is kind of like a database for contemporary Christian music, that is who our church has to pay every year for the rights to play praise music on stage. They catalog all the contemporary Christian music. So this is what we consider like modern Christian music. And they rank the top 100 in terms of how often they're used in churches. In the top 100, do you know how many songs are considered songs of lament? Throw out numbers, just guess. Four. I went through the top 100 and I looked for these 4. They can charitably be described as 4. Like in actual lamenting songs, it's actually 1.5. But let's just say 4 for the sake of argument. 4 out of 100 deals with lament. So let me ask you this question. In your life, do you only experience sadness 4% of the time? No. In fact, if we flip those numbers, it might be more accurate, no? I think some of us only experience happiness like 4% of the time. So there's this disconnect between how our worship services experience lament and our personal experiences of sadness and lament. And the consequence and the unavoidable fact is that our church has distanced itself from lament. When I say our church, I mean our Christian church. I'm speaking very broadly and generally here today. And when we kind of distance ourselves from lament, we forget how to lament. And more importantly, if you are in a place of lamenting, in a place of suffering, it's hard to go to church because there's no space for you to express and engage and process your sadness and your suffering. Throughout this series, we're going to reference a man named Walter Brueggemann, or at least I am going to reference Walter Brueggemann very often. Walter Brueggemann is a very influential and well-known Old Testament scholar. So a lot of the commentary and our understanding of Old Testament theology has somewhat come through Walter Brueggemann. And so he has a book called Peace. And in this book, he writes about the contrast between a theology of the haves and the theology of the have-nots. So we're going to read this quote, and it's going to be on the screen too. Those who live under suffering live their lives aware of the acute precariousness of their situation, Worship that arises out of suffering cries for deliverance. Their notion of themselves is that of a dependent people crying out for a vision of survival and salvation. Lament is the language of suffering. In contrast, those who live in celebration are concerned with questions of proper management and joyous celebration. Instead of deliverance, they seek constancy and sustainability. The haves do not expect their faith to begin in a cry, but rather in a song. They do not expect or need intrusion, but they rejoice in stability and durability of a world and social order that have been beneficial to them. Praise is a language of celebration. Again, we're seeking shalom, balance. It's not remove one or the other. The point of this is not to say we should feel guilty about a worship of celebration or that we should feel guilty about the success we have in life. But the point is balance. Or to put another way, it's okay to have a prosperous lifestyle. It's okay to have worship of praise and celebration. But if that prevents us from allowing people who suffer to worship, then it's a problem. If our church only has worship of celebration and no space for worship of lament, then it becomes a problem. If you remember a few weeks ago, we talked about the book of Amos, and the sin of Israel at that time was not being prosperous. That was not the issue. The issue was they were prosperous and they neglected the poor. That was the issue. And that is the shalom that we're trying to find in our church. Balance, not the elimination of one or the other. Again, lament recognizes the struggle of life and the cries for justice against existing injustices. A very easy example of the lack of lament in our church is this question: when's the last time you heard a sermon about the book of Lamentations? Or had a Bible study about the book of Lamentations? Probably not recently. Right? This is not a book of the Bible we spend much time in. But again, we are going to go through the book of Lamentations, especially the first 3 chapters. There's only 5 chapters in Lamentations. We're going to go over the first 3 in detail. And so I'm going to break down the book of Lamentations very quickly, just so you have a broad overview of the book of Lamentations. Chapter 1 talks about the shame and suffering of lament. There is a huge component. There's a huge shame factor in lament, which we're going to talk about in upcoming sermons. That's chapter 1. Chapter 2 is understanding the source of suffering. Why do we suffer? Why are we in this place? Chapter 3 talks about our engagement with suffering and the expression of lament. So how we cry out in lament. Chapter 4 talks about God's connection to suffering. So in our suffering and sadness, where is God? How does God fit into our sadness? And chapter 5 is a prayer of lament. Right? How do we process all these things? And how can we give a prayer of lament in the midst of our suffering? And so the book of Lamentation, it covers one of, if not the most darkest periods of Israelite history. This is the destruction of Jerusalem. Their city is no more. And not only is their city destroyed, they are now deported to a foreign nation to live under this nation. So the book of Lamentations and the book of Jeremiah are actually parallel books. They run through the same timeline. So Jeremiah is the historical telling of the events. So it's a very straightforward, on this date this happened, this date this happened. Lamentations is the emotional response to this event. Does that make sense? So if you read Jeremiah and Lamentations together, you get a very full picture of what's happening. You get the historical data and the emotional response to the destruction of the temple in 586 BC. This destruction of the temple, by the way, this is not like a Judeo-Christian event. What I mean by that is this is not just like a Jewish and Christian thing. This is actually a very significant world history marker, the destruction of Jerusalem. This is when essentially the nation of Israel as a country ceases to exist until 1956 or whenever it was that Israel was created. That whole time, from 586 BC to 1950s, there is no Israel. This is why when Jesus comes, the Israelites are under occupation of the Romans. This is why there's this lingering lament through the nation of Israel. It's actually really why a lot of the issues in Gaza exist today. because of the destruction of the temple in 586 BC. And so the book of Lamentations, being an emotional response, if you read it, it's very poetic. It's very dramatic, like very, very like Korean drama-esque dramatic when you read it. Jeremiah is very dry and data-driven. But in the book of Lamentations, the people cry out because their city is destroyed, right? And it's not just the city. What is Jerusalem? What is this place? It was a city given to them by God. It is really like their birthright, right? If you remember the history of Abraham and Moses, like the whole early part of Israel history was this quest to enter this promised land. And now this promised land that was given to them by God is completely destroyed. So if you read Jeremiah, which we're going to go into today, there were two responses that the Israelite people had to this cataclysmic event. The first one, they wanted to withdraw from the world. And the second, they sought out false prophets. Now, if you think about it, those are two very understandable responses to a traumatic event, right? If something really traumatic or really sad or you go through intense suffering, what do you generally do? You withdraw, right? In modern days, we call it depression. Or the other thing we do is try to find fast answers. Right? How can I fix this situation as quickly as possible? And we kind of dive deep into alternative ways that we can end or shorten our time of suffering. And so this is what the Israelites do. And I think it's very understandable that they would respond this way. So what does God say in response? Let's open to Jeremiah chapter 29. We're going to read verses 4 through 7. It says, let's go to our Bible passage. There we go. Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, to all the exiles whom I have sent into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon, build houses and live in them, plant gardens and eat their produce. Take wives and have sons and daughters. Take wives for your sons. Give your daughters in marriage, that they may bear sons and daughters. Multiply there in Babylon, and do not decrease. But seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare. So what does God say? He says, embrace Babylon. Right? He doesn't say withdraw. He doesn't say create like an enclave of Israelite settlements. He says embrace Babylon. Or to put another way, assimilate into Babylon. Marry, have children, plant gardens. The welfare of this city is also your welfare. That does not sound like something we think God would tell the Israelites, right? To just be a part of Babylon. But yet this is what God says. He says, in your lament, you must embrace the lament. Balance. In your suffering, find peace in this city. Thrive in this city. So today we're going to take these two responses and we're going to find parallels in our modern church. So in other words, how our church responds to lament. So the first one, hiding or withdrawing in the world. How does our church, when I say our church, I mean the Christian church, how do we withdraw from the world in the face of lament? In the late 19th century, the pervading thought, or like the main mission statement of the church, was light on a hill. And so you remember in Matthew, there's that parable, right? Be light on a hill, salt of the earth. So the early church in the 19th century, they believed very strongly in that idea. They believed that they should be a light on top of a hill. What that meant is they should be the ones to kind of guide society, guide the cities, guide the world towards Jesus. Right? And they really believed in the salt of the earth as well. They believed that they should be part of society to help transform it, to help make it a better place for people to live in. And so you see the individualistic element, your personal faith, and the communal element, which is how your faith makes the world a better place for people outside of your church. But in the 20th century, that began to shift. The second aspect, the communal aspect, began to decrease, and the individualistic faith started to increase. David Moberg, who is a theologian and a writer, he wrote that there was a time when evangelicals had a balanced position that gave proper attention to both evangelism and social concern, but a great reversal in the 20th century led to lopsided emphasis upon evangelism and omission of most aspects of social involvement. He points to about 1900 to 1930s as a time when the church made that transition. And that time frame correlates directly with the mass exodus of people from the inner cities into suburbs. So to put it all together, as people left the cities and entered the suburbs, the church followed, left the cities, went to the suburbs. And in that transition, there was a de-emphasis placed on social involvement and a re-emphasis placed on individual faith. The Korean Adventist Church actually follows a very similar pattern. Right? In the 70s, when we had our first huge wave of Korean immigrants, where did they go? Into the cities. Think about all the historic Koreatowns in our country. Where are they? Like the original old school Koreatowns. They're in the cities. Like Koreatown in LA, where is it? It's in the heart of Los Angeles. Koreatown in New York, where is it? It's in the heart of the cities. Where are our new Koreatowns? Buena Park, right? Marietta, Georgia, Palisades Park in New Jersey, Centerville, Virginia. Do you know where Centerville is, by the way? Centerville is the Yucaipa of DC. That's where Koreatown is. And it makes sense. In the 70s, they all went into the cities, and then where did they all go? Into the suburbs, if you think about it. And if I'm incorrect, someone please correct me. I've gone through all of our churches, all the Korean churches. I don't think there's a single church inside a city. LA Central, you would think is in the center of LA. It's not. It's right on the outskirts of East LA. It's not quite in the city. It's like right outside. Chicago Unity, you think it'd be in the United Center of Chicago? It's right next to O'Hare Airport, right outside the city. Baltimore Church, not anywhere close to the city of Baltimore. Atlanta Church is in a suburb. Detroit Church, suburb. Seattle Church, suburb. Portland Church, right outside the city, but not in the city. All of our Korean Adventist churches are actually not in cities. They're in the suburb. So our churches, specific to Korean Adventist, and really Adventist churches as a whole, we've also followed this trend where we left the cities and gone into the suburbs. Now, again, there is nothing wrong with moving to the suburbs. There really isn't anything wrong with it. But if you neglect the city, then there's a problem. We understand the motive, the parallel or the pattern here, right? One thing is not wrong, but if it comes at the cost of another, then it becomes a problem. Right? When one thing goes up, one thing goes down, and balance is off, we no longer have shalom. So the idea is to create a balance, to have these things, but to not forget these things. The second way that Israel responded was they sought false prophets. So let's go back to the Bible, Jeremiah chapter 29. We're going to read verses 8 and 9. It's also on the screen. Jeremiah 28, verses 8 and 9. For thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, do not let your prophets and your diviners who are among you deceive you, and do not listen to the dreams that they dream. For it is a lie that they are prophesying to you in my name. I did not send them, declare the Lord. So this requires some explanation. So within the community of Israel in Babylon, there were prophets and as it's written in the Bible, diviners. And so these people would tell the Israelites, hey, this exile, it's going to be really short. Don't worry. If you just wait it out, we're going to rebuild Jerusalem even better than before. Trust what I'm saying. That sounds very appealing for a group of people who saw their city destroyed and are now exiled in a foreign nation. Right? These prophets were telling the Israelites exactly what they wanted to hear. And the Israelites were buying in, listening to what they were saying. But what does God say? I did not send them. Or to put another way, this is going to be a very long exile for you guys. Don't listen to these liars. When we go through suffering, and I mentioned this before, we want quick fixes. Right? We want the suffering to end as quickly as possible. No one here enjoys being in suffering. I think that's a pretty safe general statement to make. No one loves to be in suffering. And so we want to exit that state of being as quickly as possible, and the Israelites are no exceptions. And they sought out what we call diviners. We all know this phrase, divination, right? Divination is a desire to know and control the future by removing uncertainty. So astronomy is a form of divination, right? Why do we want to learn about our astronomical signs? Because we hope that it will tell us what we should do. It removes uncertainty. I was in an airport a while ago, and we were eating in like the food court area, and there were these two people talking to each other. They were clearly strangers. Okay, so they didn't know each other. And this one person's really just kind of like bearing her soul to this other lady. And the other lady, it comes out in conversation that she is like a professional astrologist or astronomer. So she's like good at reading stars and telling you what your future will be. And so the first lady, when she hears it, she goes, "Oh, well, can I get some advice from you? You know, I'm thinking of leaving my husband. What does the stars tell me I should do?" And so the other lady's like, "Well, what's your sign?" And she's like, "Aries from like the fifth moon." I don't know what she said. And she's like, "Okay, well, your star says I think you should take this decision like carefully. Don't rush." I remember sitting there like, of course that's the response. Like, what else are you going to say to her? Or like, what are you going to say? Like, "Oh, leave now." No, of course not. And I just remember thinking to myself, like, this is like such a ridiculous conversation I'm hearing. But why is she seeking this advice? Because it's supposed to remove uncertainty, although in this case, it really didn't remove any uncertainty. Like, you know, be careful with this decision. I don't know, that's not very clear. But it's supposed to remove uncertainty. Divination is supposed to tell us exactly what is going to happen. And again, this is what the Israelites are looking for. What they want is a vending machine. When you go to a vending machine, you see what you want. What are the odds that you're going to get what you want? Very high. You see a bag of Cheetos. I want Cheetos. You put D8, put in your money. What do you get? Cheetos. If you get a pack of peanuts, something went horribly wrong, right? Vending machines has a very high certainty of what you want. And the Israelites wanted God to operate like a vending machine. This is what we want. We will submit our prayer as payment. Give us what we want. Unfortunately, or fortunately, God does not function as a vending machine. Because if you think about it, if you read what's said, give us what we want. Right? God operates on his plan, not our plan. What we want and what God wants sometimes are not quite aligned. And in times like that, while it's very easy for us to seek alternative answers, second opinions, God knows what is best for us. God knows the eternal timeline. God knows what the process is. And that is where that trust needs to come in. And it's very difficult to do in times of suffering. But that is what God calls us to do. It's very, very easy, very tempting to try to speed up the process. Very easy and tempting to try to remove all uncertainty from suffering. But the more we do so, the more we harm ourselves. And the more we try to avoid lament, the more toxic the situation becomes. And once we remove lament, we think we found shalom. Right? As our churches moved away from lament and minimized the presence of lament in our churches, we thought we found shalom, but we haven't. All we're experiencing is simply the lack of conflict. If there's a lack of conflict, does it mean conflict no longer exists? No, it still exists. We just refuse to acknowledge the conflict. The conflict is still there. The suffering is still there. We just choose not to look at it, and we look elsewhere. We distract ourselves while all this is happening. And again, the ultimate consequence of that, there's no longer a space for lament in our churches. True shalom, true peace, requires us to see and accept the suffering that is happening around us. That is what true shalom means. So how do we do that? When I was younger and I listened to sermons, pastors would have these great theological, philosophical points, but they never answer how you do it. And it always made me very frustrated. So I said to myself, if I become a pastor, I'm never going to end a sermon with some theoretical thought. I'm going to make it super practical. So I'm going to answer this question. How do we create a space for lament in this church? I'm going to give you one thing that we can do. This is not the only thing. This is just one thing I think our church can do. We have to be real. We have to be honest. When you come to church on Saturday and you see someone for the first time that day, what do you say to them? Hey, how are you doing? And what is the socially acceptable response to that question? I'm good, right? That is a socially acceptable response. If you say anything besides I'm good, it's weird. Am I right? How are you doing? It's kind of almost like a greeting. It's not an actual question. Imagine if you're at church, you come in, you get out of your car, and you see someone go, hey, how are you doing? And they go, I had the worst week. Let me tell you how difficult my week was. It's very uncomfortable, right? You wanted a quick 6-second exchange, and all of a sudden you're in this deep conversation with someone. That's not what you want. You have things to do. You have places to be. You don't have time for this conversation with this person. But yet we ask the question, how are you doing anyway? Last week was a very hectic time for me. So we were at West Coast Camp meeting in PUC. And the idea was, I was leading praise last week, if you all saw. And the idea was that I would come back to LA by 5 o'clock on Friday. And then we'd have praise practice at around 7. And kind of right before we left, I just felt like we weren't going to be able to make it. And so I called the praise team and I was like, hey, I'm not going to make it in time. I got to LA at 11:30 p.m. on Friday, not 5 o'clock p.m. And so I'm like, I'm not going to church. I'm going to go home. I've been on the road for 9 hours. No, thank you. So the plan was I'm going to be at church at 8 a.m., practice is at 8:30. That'll give me 30 minutes to set all this up, set up the stuff in the back. If I be very quick in my time, I can make it. I did not come at 8 o'clock. I came at 8:20. I have 10 minutes to set everything up. I'm running around setting up, and I left the door open so the praise team could enter. And so I was at the stage, and I heard someone walk in and say, hey. So I thought it was Cass, because Cass is usually the one that's on time, and he comes and says hi. So I'm like, hey, and I turned up, and it was not Cass. It was someone I've never seen before in my life. And he had a Shiba Inu dog with him. So then my first thought is oh no, you're not allowed to have a dog in here. How do I tell this man to leave with his dog? But, I say hey, what can I do for you? And so this guy goes, I haven't been in church in a long time. So for me, it's oh, okay. And the guy starts walking, and he makes his way to the seat to sit. So what am I thinking the whole time he's walking? You got a dog. You can't be here. I got stuff to do. I had to set up the praise team. I have slides to make. Where are you going? And so he comes and he sits. And the minute he sits on the seat, the man just starts sobbing uncontrollably. So what am I going to do? Am I going to be bro, you gotta, sorry, cry in the lobby. No. I sat down, I talked to him, and as he's crying, he's talking about how his father recently passed away, how they were on really bad terms, that recently they were starting to make amends, and then he died. So there's a sense of why? We were getting somewhere good, and then this happened. He has a really young daughter who, the stress of fatherhood. Yes, we all know the stress of fatherhood and parenthood. And all these things on his shoulder. He was just crying. There were two parts of me in that moment. There was a part of me that was I gotta get back to work. I got stuff I gotta do. And the other half was be a human. Listen to him. Who cares if church starts late? Who cares if some people are angry that a dog is in the sanctuary? This is more important. And it was in that moment that I realized when we feel busy, we forget why we're busy. our deacons especially, you have so many things to do in this church, right? Chairs to set up, potluck room to set up, food to prepare, praise team, we have equipment to set up, tech team, all that stuff. Pastors, we have, all the people to get, what is the purpose of all that? Is it not to have a church of worship? Is that not the greater purpose? Right? It was a reminder for me that sometimes we need to create a space for people to lament. And that is how. My challenge is very simple, but it's very difficult. The next time someone says, hey, how are you doing? Be honest. Tell them how you're really doing. And if you are the one asking, hey, how are you doing? Be prepared to have a conversation. Or to put another way, don't use that phrase as a way to say hi. If you want to say hi, just say hi. But if you ask, how are you doing? Be prepared for an actual answer. I think if we do that, we will then very literally create a space where we can experience lament. And do you know who the biggest offender of that is? Me. Anytime someone says, how are you doing? My answer is oh, I'm good. Even if I'm not good. And when I ask someone, hey, how are you doing? I'm not trying to know. I'm just trying to say hi in a more polite way. So I have to change the way I ask this question. And if I ask someone that question, I have to be ready to not do all this stuff and be present in the moment and listen to what they have to say. It's really hard to do because we're undoing decades of greetings at church. But I think we got to do it. I think if we can all do it, it'll shift our church a little bit. We will now have space for people to share in their lament. So let's try that. Really. This is not a theoretical, rhetorical. Let's actually try this. If someone says, how are you doing? Be honest in your response. And if you ask, how are you doing? Be prepared for a conversation. Let's see how this changes our church. Because if we do this, I think word will get out that there is a church you can go to if you're feeling suffering. Right? Word will get out. There is a church you can go to experience lament in worship and celebration in worship. I think the word will get out that there's a safe place with people who want to listen to what you have to say, who want to create a space for you to suffer, and who want to help you get to a place of celebration. And I think word will get out that there is a church that has true shalom at the center of its worship. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you again for your Sabbath, for us to come together to worship you, to praise you, to celebrate with you all the good things that are happening in life, but also that we can come in our lament, to lay our sufferings at your feet, all the things that stress us out, the stuff from work and school and all these things that drag us down, that we can lay them at your feet. And at least for this one day, we can worship you in peace. I pray that no matter how our week was, no matter what our past experience was, that at this moment, we can connect with you, that we can connect with you to give thanks for all you've done, and that we can also connect with you in anger for all the sufferings that we have gone through. And I pray that you will help our church to be able to support both types of worship, that we can have a worship of celebration and praise and a worship of lament, that we will find true shalom in our worship service, and that people who suffer, who have nowhere to go to share the lament, will find their way here to be able to talk to any one of us and to be given time to share their suffering so they can experience you and find that peace and find that connection, find that hope in you. In your name I pray.